Timothy Dexter, the luckiest fool in all of American history. A documentary script, formatted for narration, voiceover, and subtitle generation. Meet the single luckiest, most absurd businessman in the entire history of the United States of America. While everyone else studied the markets and carefully calculated their risks, this man relied almost entirely on sheer, unfiltered stupidity. Nearly every ridiculous financial decision he made should have bankrupted him completely and permanently. Instead, he somehow accidentally built a multi-million-dollar fortune and became a genuine legend. History remembers him as a fool, but his bank account told a very different story entirely. This is the strange, almost unbelievable, thoroughly documented story of Timothy Dexter, the early life and the currency gamble. Timothy Dexter was born in Massachusetts in 1747, with almost no formal education to speak of. He grew up working as an illiterate laborer, using his hands to get by, however he possibly could each day. Then, at one pivotal moment, he made a move that most of society considered pure financial suicide. At the end of the Revolutionary War, the American government found itself drowning in overwhelming debt. They had issued continental paper currency that rapidly collapsed in value until it became essentially worthless to ordinary people. Everyday citizens threw away their paper money in disgust, cursing the government for what felt like a total loss. Timothy Dexter looked at all of that worthless paper and decided to buy up as much of it as possible. He spent every coin he had acquiring massive chests full of this supposedly dead currency. Everyone around him laughed at what looked like a complete and total absence of basic economic sense. They genuinely believed he had lost his mind and thrown his entire life savings straight into the garbage. What none of them realized was that Alexander Hamilton and the new Treasury Department were about to redeem those very bonds at full value. Almost overnight, Timothy Dexter woke up as an extraordinarily wealthy man, shipping coal to Newcastle. With his brand new fortune securely in hand, Dexter set his sights on joining New England's elite merchant class. The established upper-class businessmen despised him, largely because he lacked manners, refinement, and even basic literacy. They decided to play a cruel practical joke on him, hoping to ruin his fortune and humiliate him publicly in the process. They advised him to buy massive quantities of coal and ship it all the way across the ocean to Newcastle. Newcastle, of course, was already the coal capital of England, famous worldwide for producing more coal than almost anywhere else on Earth. Shipping coal to Newcastle was, in essence, the historical equivalent of trying to sell ice to Antarctica. Dexter, completely unaware of how global trade actually worked, walked right into their trap without a second thought. He purchased several cargo ships, loaded them to the very brim with tons of black coal, and sent them off. When his ships finally reached England, local merchants reportedly burst out laughing at what looked like total ignorance on his part. For a brief moment, it genuinely looked like the prank had worked, and Dexter was about to lose everything. But the universe seemed to have a bizarre, almost personal sense of humor reserved specifically for Timothy Dexter. The very week his ships arrived in Newcastle, a massive, violent coal miners' strike broke out across the entire region. Local mines shut down completely, and the whole city suddenly found itself freezing without any fuel to speak of. Dexter's unexpected foreign coal arrived at exactly the moment of greatest desperation, purely by coincidence. He sold every single lump of coal at an absolutely astronomical markup, walking away with a staggering profit. The very men who had tried to ruin him ended up making him considerably richer than he had been before. Stray cats and whalebones. Never quite learning his lesson about taking advice from people who clearly wished him harm, Dexter fell for another elaborate prank. His rivals told him that stray cats were apparently in massive demand on the tropical island of Trinidad. They convinced him that the island was suffering through a catastrophic rat infestation that desperately needed solving. Dexter immediately hired local boys to round up stray cats across Massachusetts, gathering them by the thousands. He loaded nearly 40,000 yowling, scratching cats onto cargo ships and set sail south toward the Caribbean. When he finally arrived in Trinidad, it turned out the local sugar plantations really were overrun with rats and mice. Plantation owners eagerly bought up every single cat available, desperate to protect their valuable crops from further destruction. Dexter walked away with yet another massive fortune, all from what was originally intended as a cruel joke at his expense. Shortly after that bizarre venture, his rivals struck again with an equally ridiculous suggestion. They told him to buy up massive quantities of whalebone, known formally as baleen, assuming it was entirely useless. Dexter spent a considerable fortune purchasing every bit of whalebone he could possibly find on the open market. Almost immediately after he cornered the supply, a radical new fashion trend swept through elite society across Europe. Women's corsets and elaborate dresses suddenly required rigid whalebone to maintain their fashionable, extravagant shapes. Because Dexter had unknowingly cornered the entire global market, clothing manufacturers had no choice but to buy directly from him, on his own terms. Every single trap set specifically to ruin him somehow transformed into an accidental golden opportunity instead. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how consistently this pattern repeated itself throughout his career. Most historians who have studied Dexter's life describe an almost uncanny run of good fortune, one that seems to defy any reasonable explanation. Economic historians have pointed out that Dexter's success also depended on a genuinely chaotic, unpredictable economic period in early American history. Currency instability, volatile international trade, and rapidly shifting fashion trends created an environment where extreme risks occasionally paid off spectacularly. That does not fully explain his success, but it does help clarify why his particular brand of reckless confidence was even possible in the first place. More eccentric ventures. Coal, cats, and whalebone were far from the only bizarre business decisions attributed to Timothy Dexter over the years. At one point, he reportedly attempted to export warming pans to the Caribbean, a region that, needless to say, had little use for them. By most accounts, local merchants in the Caribbean quickly discovered a clever alternative use for these pans within the local molasses industry. Once again, what should have been an obvious financial disaster somehow transformed into another unexpected profit for Dexter. He also reportedly invested heavily in Bibles, sending large shipments to the East Indies at a time when few expected any real demand. According to some accounts, a religious missionary happened to arrive in the region shortly afterward, creating sudden demand for exactly what Dexter had shipped. Whether every single one of these stories is entirely accurate remains a matter of some historical debate among researchers. Dexter himself was known for embellishing his own legend, and some of these tales likely grew more elaborate with each retelling over the years. What remains consistent across nearly every account, however, is the underlying pattern of reckless decisions somehow landing on their feet. Lord Timothy Dexter and his mansion. With more money than he could reasonably ever spend, Dexter relocated to Newburyport and purchased a genuinely lavish estate. He decided that he was no longer simply a wealthy merchant, but something closer to actual nobility. He officially declared himself Lord Timothy Dexter and insisted that everyone around him address him using this brand new title. His mansion quickly became a bizarre local tourist attraction, filled with hundreds of strange and elaborate decorations. Newburyport itself was, at the time, a genuinely wealthy shipping town, home to sea captains, merchants, and established old money families. For a self-made, largely uneducated man like Dexter to move into that world was already a source of considerable social tension. Rather than trying to blend in quietly, Dexter apparently decided the better strategy was to become as visible and outrageous as humanly possible. He installed a massive wooden fence surrounding his property, topping every single post with an elaborately carved statue of a famous historical figure. He placed statues of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and even Napoleon Bonaparte scattered across his sprawling front lawn. Some accounts suggest he eventually commissioned somewhere between 30 and 40 of these life-sized wooden statues in total. Right in the middle of all these historical giants, he proudly placed an enormous carved statue of himself. The inscription carved at the base of his own statue boldly declared him the greatest man in the entire Eastern world. He even went so far as to hire a personal poet to live on his estate, tasked solely with singing endless praises of his greatness. That poet, a man named Jonathan Plummer, reportedly wrote glowing verses about Dexter in exchange for room, board, and a small salary. Visitors traveling through Newburyport would often stop simply to gawk at the strange spectacle Dexter had built for himself. Whether they found it ridiculous or oddly impressive, Few people who passed through town could resist stopping to take a look. The fake funeral. As the years went on, Lord Timothy Dexter grew increasingly curious about how much people genuinely cared about him. He wanted to know exactly who would show up to mourn his death and what they might say behind his back. So, in 1811, he made the decision to stage his own elaborate, entirely fake funeral. He spread word throughout the town that he had tragically passed away following a sudden, unexpected illness. Hundreds of people gathered at his sprawling estate to attend what they believed was a genuine wake, hoping to pay their respects. His wife played along with the entire scheme, dressing in traditional mourning black and pretending to weep on cue. Unbeknownst to the crowd, Dexter secretly hid upstairs in a private room, watching the entire ceremony unfold through a window. He noticed that while many guests were happily eating and drinking, his wife did not appear to be crying nearly hard enough for his liking. Unable to contain his temper any longer, Dexter suddenly burst downstairs into the middle of the crowded room in a genuine rage. He grabbed a heavy wooden cane and began striking his wife for what he considered an unconvincing display of sorrow at his own funeral. The stunned, bewildered guests slowly realized they had all been tricked by a very much alive man staging an elaborate personal stunt. Reports suggest the funeral itself was otherwise conducted with genuine formality, complete with a minister and a full eulogy delivered in his honor. Some accounts claim as many as 3,000 people attended, drawn by curiosity, respect, or perhaps simply the promise of free food and drink. Dexter apparently considered the entire event a success overall, despite the awkward confrontation with his wife toward the end of the evening, a pickle for the knowing ones. Eventually, Dexter decided he wanted to leave a permanent, lasting mark on the literary world as well. He wrote a genuinely bizarre, rambling autobiography, which he titled A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. The book amounted to a chaotic rant, complaining loudly about politicians, the clergy, and anyone who had ever dared to doubt his intelligence. The most shocking element of the entire book was not its wild content, but its complete and total absence of punctuation. Dexter refused to use a single comma, period, or any other conventional punctuation mark from the very first page to the last. When readers complained that the book was nearly impossible to follow without any punctuation or clear sentence breaks, he responded with outrage. Rather than simply adding proper punctuation to the second edition, he took a wildly different approach entirely. He added an entirely new page at the very end of the book, filled with rows and rows of random punctuation marks. He instructed his frustrated readers to distribute the commas and periods themselves, wherever they personally felt they belonged. It stood as one of history's great acts of stubborn defiance, from a man who broke every conventional rule and still somehow came out ahead. Remarkably, the book went through several printings during his own lifetime, suggesting readers found it entertaining even if they never quite finished parsing it. Later editions occasionally included the punctuation page exactly as Dexter had originally designed it, preserved as a curious piece of publishing history. Some literary historians have since pointed out that the book, chaotic as it was, offers a genuinely unfiltered window into how Dexter actually saw himself. He clearly believed he deserved recognition as a serious thinker, even while the rest of educated society continued to view him as an amusing curiosity, the legacy of history's greatest accidental success story. Timothy Dexter passed away in 1806, leaving behind a legacy defined by pure, unfiltered eccentricity. He proved, almost by accident, that you do not necessarily need formal education, refinement, or conventional intelligence to succeed. Sometimes, apparently, all you really need is an ocean of blind luck and the sheer confidence of a man willing to ship coal to Newcastle. His life remains one of the most genuinely unbelievable, almost comedic stories that ever actually unfolded in American history. Economists and historians still occasionally reference his story today, usually as a colorful illustration of how unpredictable early markets could truly be. Whether you view him as a fool who got remarkably lucky, or as a strange kind of self-made genius, his story endures for good reason. If you enjoyed this strange dive into one of history's oddest corners, please consider subscribing for more stories exactly like this one. Drop a comment below and let us know whether you think Timothy Dexter was secretly a genius or simply the luckiest fool who ever lived. Either way, his story remains a strange, delightful reminder that history does not always reward the people who play by the rules.